Let's go!
So yeah, let's talk about Marvel vs. Capcom as a whole and why my reaction was so notably big. It's almost like my reaction became a point of conversation outside of the fact that a Marvel vs. Capcom collection was announced. It was very weird. It went viral. Why was that the way it was? There's a lot to it. And I feel like maybe it's a bit more, it makes a bit more sense to people now, based on the reaction over the past few days, as we just discussed, like people making fan art, the responses from people on Twitter and videos and everything. Like the world has lit up with Marvel vs. Capcom love and affection because it's back, right? But ultimately, why would Max be freaking out so much? Why am I being shilled and obviously overacting for something that is effectively 30-year-old games that you can play on Fightcade? Why, you bitch? Most importantly, I think we got to go back a few years to talk about why this was an impossibility, why we're in the one universe in 16,405 chances of this happening. And it's because Marvel vs. Capcom was dead. We got to go back even before MVCI, before Ultimate Marvel 3, before Marvel 3, and even going back to Marvel 2. The relationship that Capcom and Marvel have from the 90s to MVC2, which extends until the early 2000s, and that's about it, is very touch and go. Marvel's a much different company at the time. Their licensing for their properties is dirt cheap. You know, historically, there's some funny things that Sony bought the licensing for Spider-Man back in the 90s or something like that to make movies for like, what was it, 15 grand? The reason behind this is because Marvel at the time was effectively going through like bankruptcy because the comic book industry was crashing. It exploded in the early 90s. It effectively was going through what happened to COVID and all of media during COVID happening. And now there's this downturn. That happened to Marvel, where it blew up in the span of one part of a decade, and at the end of that decade, it was dirt cheap. You couldn't even sell comic books anymore for anything close to the value that they were perceived to have. Comic books in the 90s and what Marvel effectively was in charge of was like Bitcoin. If we're being real, you're buying this thing that is inherently invaluable right now, but will put my kids through college type shit. That's what it was. So all the Marvel vs. Capcom games are built around that idea. The rights for these characters were not inherently super expensive. We got to flash forward now to the early 2010s / late 2000s. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 comes back in 08-09. Right around the same time, Street Fighter 4 comes back. It's a big Capcom fighting game renaissance. The game is a port of the Dreamcast version, and it comes out on PS3 and Xbox 360. Goes on to become the best-selling digital game of all time. At the time, digital games were not commonplace yet. Some things like Limbo, indie-made 2D platformers were kind of all that really existed. Capcom jumped at the forefront and they're like, hey, we got a couple of digital games we want to sell. We did HD Remix, we did Puzzle Fighter, here's Marvel vs. Capcom 2. But still, MVC2 came out and just blew up. Everybody had a chance to just digitally buy Marvel 2, and we did. And it was amazing. The majority of people that had a PS3 or 360 back in the day probably had Marvel 2 on it in some way. That has a pretty huge impact, which leads directly into Marvel vs. Capcom 3, which happens 2 to 3 years later, which would be the about appropriate dev time for a title in that era, in like the 2010s, 2011s. Play it at EVO. It's great. Marvel's back, but there's clearly something off. The roster is not, I think, what everybody's expecting. It's okay. The default roster in Marvel 3 is only okay. It gets a lot better in Ultimate Marvel 3. But obviously, Ultimate Marvel 3 launched like 6, 7 months, 8 months right after Vanilla Marvel 3. So there's a lot of drama that happens there, but does okay. Right? Vanilla Marvel 3 does okay, and Ultimate Marvel 3 goes on to sell pretty dang good. But there is a clear, massive influence in both of the rosters of the game. What the fuck is a Rocket Raccoon? Who the hell is Nova? I've never even heard of X-23 before. Dormammu? What the shit is MODOK? This is at the time when I believe Captain America, the first movie, was coming out, and people were not aware of this MCU-ness at all, but clearly at Marvel, the MCU was heavily thought up for a long time, and they had a plan of attack and Avengers and all this shit, right? That heavily was influencing the character choices in Marvel 3 at the time. So much so, and we have to give credit to people like Seth Killian, who were working at Capcom, had to let Marvel know, you have to put in characters like Sentinel, Magneto, and Storm. And from what I recall, Magneto was probably going to be in it, but Sentinel and Storm were going to be excluded, where he had to fight hard. The Marvel influence was very intense, and there's stories of even about Doctor Strange, Capcom folks working their asses off to appease the Marvel executives and the Marvel tenure about, like, how do we get the hand signals for Doctor Strange to be the right thing, because Marvel is insanely meticulous with all this stuff. It was not an easy development, is what I'm trying to say. Outside of that, how do I know it was not an easy development? I literally worked with Marvel and Capcom in 2011 and 2012 for Marvel vs. Capcom 3. Literally had to go through the exact same process of licensing and approval for our goofy characters of our goofy YouTube series in the same way that Capcom had to. And Capcom foot the bill on insanely expensive licensing that was 2 to 3 times more the cost our entire production budget, because they did not want us to use costume characters. They wanted us to use their own characters, and their own characters and their versions of characters that we were going to bring in were like goofy ass Party City things. It was weird. So again, Marvel and Capcom, it's like opposite sides of a magnet. They're like always at each other's heads with the MVC series right around Marvel vs. Capcom 3. This continues. Marvel Origins comes out less than a year later. Comes out about 9 months after Ultimate Marvel 3. Marvel vs. Capcom Origins is the only other MVC collection that exists. Came out on 360 and PS3. That game we also did a big series for. Had to go through approvals and stuff. It was once again a nightmare. We had to change entire parts of our film that were already shot because of the way certain Marvel characters were depicted. The weird thing about that collection is that the Marvel vs. Capcom Origins collection is only 2 games. It's Marvel Superheroes and MVC 1. MVC 1 is great, but Marvel Superheroes is a weird call. Why is it a weird call? Because there's another game in the MVC franchise that has never gotten a faithful console port outside of Japan, and that was X-Men vs. Street Fighter. A lot of people wanted it to be X-Men vs. Street Fighter and MVC 1, because ultimately, MVC Origins does not sell that much. It goes on to not be a great game in terms of sales, because really it didn't have the games people were expecting. At the time, X-Men was effectively being completely phased out at Marvel. From t-shirts to media, Wolverine died in the comics, like everything, man. Due to the fact that the licensing rights, the movie rights, were still at Fox, and Disney owned Marvel. This is way before the Fox merger. This all leads up to something very substantial. I guarantee you. 2 years later, 2014, Marvel vs. Capcom is dead. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 and Marvel vs. Capcom Origins are effectively delisted from PlayStation as well as Xbox, PS3 and Xbox. And you cannot get them again. Marvel Origins, unpurchasable, straight up. MVC 2 gets a weird physical release, which is effectively a box with a code in it. Over the years, this physical release, if it did indeed have the code and was unopened, would go for upwards of $300 to $400. Absolutely insane, because there was no way to buy Marvel vs. Capcom 2 anymore. MVC wouldn't stay dead for that long, because even as late as 2014, early 2015, Marvel Infinite is in development, but these games do not come back. The old Marvel vs. Capcoms do not come back. Marvel Infinite happens in 2016, it's announced, comes out in 2017. And also Marvel 3 comes back. They release a PlayStation 4 version, a PC version. Hallelujah. That's actually great. Those were one of the best things they did in the MVCI era of Marvel vs. Capcom back in 2016, 2017. But ultimately, we don't get the old games. They're gone. The licensing for these old games was not figured out in any way. Well, we're stuck. MVCI tanks and is left dead and buried in early 2018. At this time, Capcom is getting a lot of ire because Street Fighter V launched a year before in a terrible spot, and then MVCI shows up and launches in a terrible spot. This is the second dark age of Capcom fighting games is what this is. So this is brutal, and I'm at the forefront of it, man. I'm like the Marvel vs. Capcom guy. It was easily one of like the worst years because I watched the thing that I love so much become the focus of all of the internet's ire. And whether or not I was defending a part of it, I was a shill. Whether or not I was advocating for change and hoping that this is not the same and this is not good, I was getting fans upset at me not standing the game. Zero win situation. I was always going to be caught in between. There was no way around it. MVCI sinks the franchise. It is done. We don't hear anything about Marvel vs. Capcom for years. And it seems like from a development perspective that Marvel and Capcom want nothing to do with each other. But shit starts changing about 3 to 4 years down the line. There's a massive shakeup at Capcom in early 2020, where their fighting game division is being completely restructured. And at the same time, I run a tournament because I was super inspired by the Parsec era of MVC. It was like the main thing I was watching at night, whether it was Kevin Ha or Tong or any of these dudes that were Tampa Never Sleeps, were running Parsec Marvel tournaments, and they found a way to play Marvel 3 online without the netcode sucking, you know? It was cool. Inspired by that, I want to hold an official tournament on Twitch with Twitch rivals. And we call it the Marvel Lives Tournament. And we bring back all the biggest heads from Marvel 3's history. Can we all play on Parsec in this time frame? Can we get the approval of Marvel and Capcom? The answer is no. The answer is, well, that doesn't work because we need licensing approval. That doesn't work because we can't use Parsec. We don't have the licensing for Parsec. And this is an official Twitch tournament, so no, this isn't going to work. The nice part is that I have enough friends over at Twitch, Rick included, who runs Evo now, that really wants to do this. And I know a few people, at least at Marvel and Capcom, where I'm like, hey, I'm not going to destroy your brand here. Okay, we're actually going to bring back Assist Me. We're going to do a limited show. It's a live action tournament event, yada, yada, yada. It's going to be this big, cool thing, sort of a celebration of Marvel versus Capcom 3. That's all it really is, because that's what most of my tournaments are, right? And somehow, in some way, the people I know at Marvel are cool with it, and the people I know at Capcom are cool with it. I'm over the fucking moon. I have to do so much work, it's insane. I was insanely stressed out, but having Marvel versus Capcom back and people at least approaching the franchise with perspective of appreciation in any way meant a lot to me, where it's like, yo, okay, we can make MVC pop off in some way. A lot of people are excited for this tournament. Long story short, it blows up. And I'm like, wow, this is pretty cool. I see an opportunity to bring a little campaign called #free Marvel vs. Capcom 2 with very specific timing and a very specific message. I wanted people to know that MVC2 is still gone, and it's one of the most beloved games of all time. You just couldn't buy these games anymore. The only way you can play them was through emulation or finding an old copy that cost you literally hundreds of dollars. And to me, it was a cardinal sin. And guess what? It exploded. Celebrities were endorsing it. All these other content creators were endorsing it. Worldwide trending, like #2 to #1 worldwide trending on Twitter for the initial day we did, and stayed in top 10 trending for several days. It was nuts. I couldn't believe the response. All that did was just reinforce the thought process that no, people love MVC as much as I do. There is an active amount and a lot of people that would be willing to support this stuff if it is what they want and not the thing that it was, you know? And this is where we come to the part of the story. Why did Max freak out so big? The 1 in 14,605,000 chance, everything around that revolved around my personal understanding of how far this had gone and the powers that be that went out of their way to try to make this happen. There was active like movement going on, and then it stopped. Completely stopped dead in its tracks. And everything that I understood about the chances was that there is no chance. It's over. And I was big sad. I was big sad internally. But I had to start letting people know that, no, I don't want to talk about Marvel vs. Capcom anymore. 3 years pass. And a Nintendo Direct. To my absolute bewilderment, it's happening. And it isn't just MVC2, it's everything. It's every single game. Almost an entire high school career later, it happens. At a Nintendo Direct. And I lose my fucking mind. Because the thing that I had loved so much that I presumed was dead, buried, and we need to forget about it and we need to move forward. It was like a friend of mine had passed away. They came back to life in front of my eyes type shit. And this isn't just a video game to me. This shit launched my career for the past 13, 14 years. My entire career as a huge part of my life. To me, this wasn't just a collection of 30-year-old games. This was something that I fought like hard for. That I did my best to champion to any regard, to any degree, whether or not it's the competitive side or the casual side or anything. Getting this collection was an impossibility. Marvel vs. Capcom coming back and being a real thing again that is not dead was like watching goddamn Gil get off the ground after his life bar was depleted and he lifted into the sky. For anybody that might have been critical of my reaction to Marvel vs. Capcom collection and to turn into the absolute insane Homer Simpson screaming idiot that I was, I feel it was perfectly valid. And I am living in a dream right now.